Hello, welcome to American Government. Today we're talking about chapters 14 and 15, and these deal with the President of the United States, and they deal with the executive branch, the giant bureaucracy that affects all of our lives. All right, let's move on here. These are the chart of all the presidents of the United States. There have been now, we're in president number 46. There's actually only been 45 men who have been president, but we would call it 46 because Grover Cleveland was president twice in this two terms being separated. And so he gets to count twice. So 46 presidents of the United States since its founding. One thing you'll notice by looking at this picture is they're all men and they're all white. What is the president actually? The framers of the Constitution wanted to put all the power of the US government into the legislative branch of the government. They wanted to avoid having something like a king having just fought a long war of independence against the British king. The American framers wanted to make sure that George Washington or some other person wouldn't emerge as some kind of autocrat or some kind of king or something like that. And so the Constitution was written with that in mind. And it gives the power of the purse, the power of the money to Congress. It also puts certain restrictions upon the power of the president, that because the president has to get approval of Congress to do various kinds of things, like make appointments to the bureaucracy, ambassadors, various kinds of the judicial appointments, those kinds of things. And so the checks balances in the Constitution are meant to give power to Congress. At the same time, the president is given certain powers and authority by the Constitution that put a check on the power of Congress. According to the US Constitution, Article 2 is the one that deals with the presidency, and it says there that the president is elected to a 4-year term. The Constitution originally did not put any term limits on the election of the presidency. It does make the election of the president indirect. That is, the states have power to elect the president through what's called the Electoral College, which I'll talk about in a second here. The president has to be 35 years old at the time they take office. And interestingly, they have to be born in the United States or the territories that became the United States. This is the only federal office that requires a person who has been born in the United States. Congress people, they have to be citizens for 7 or 9 years. Justices, it doesn't even say they have to be citizens, I think there's no minimum age for Supreme Court justices, and nothing saying that they be born in the US. But this one said they had to be born in the US. Now, this was probably a way to prevent the British from interfering with things by trying to get somebody who was born in England and might be still loyal to the crown that would become the president of the United States. The president gets a salary. And there's one thing the president is required to do, which is to take an oath of office when he becomes the president. But then he does this on Inauguration Day every 4 years. The president has to swear to uphold the Constitution of the United States. Powers of the president, he is the commander-in-chief of the military. And so he, in effect, orders the military into battle and things like that. Now, he does not have the power to declare war. That's restricted to Congress. Now, he does have the power to give pardons to people who have been convicted of federal crimes. He cannot pardon a person convicted of a state crime, but he can pardon a person convicted of a federal crime. He signs treaties, although he doesn't ratify them. Treaties have to be ratified by the Senate before they go into effect. But he signs treaties and negotiated signs them. He makes appointments, judges, directors of programs, cabinet officers, senators. If there's the need to appoint a senator, he can appoint one temporarily. So he has the power to do that. Those appointments, though, as I mentioned, have to be ratified by the US Senate. The president is required to give a State of the Union address, a message. He's supposed to send it to Congress periodically, it says. And what has become the custom is for the president to give a speech to both houses of Congress on live television sometime around the end of January, beginning of February each year. The State of the Union is meant to be a message to Congress saying basically, how are things going? presidents tend to use it as a kind of campaign speech, talking about the various programs they want Congress to deal with. Lately, a lot of the State of Union addresses have had various kind of visitors who are called out and are applauded by everybody for being heroes or having done something special, et cetera. The president can call in to session special legislative sessions of Congress. If Congress leaves town and he feels that they must come back and deal with something, they can be called back into a special session. He commissions officers in the military. Article 2, Section 4 deals with impeachment and conviction. The president can be impeached for bribery, treason, or high crimes and misdemeanors by the House by a simple majority. He will go through a trial by the Senate, and the Senate has to convict him with a 2/3 majority of those present during the trial. Two important phrases here. One, in Article 2, Section 2, it uses this phrase, by and with the advice and consent of the Senate. Advice and consent of the Senate. So this means basically that the Senate has to hear about appointments and treaties, and it has to give consent to them. It has to give approval to them. So it doesn't actually say that the Senate has to approve. It says advice and consent. So the advice of the Senate might be, don't do this. Don't sign this treaty. Don't make this appointment. In which case, then the appointment or the treaty doesn't go into effect. Third thing is, second thing here, these phrases here is in Article 2, Section 3. It says that he shall take care that the laws be faithfully executed. Gives the power of the president to interpret and determine enforcement of the law. Okay, so he, now that's interesting. It uses the word he here to describe the president. And most of the Constitution, the word he is missing. She doesn't appear anywhere in the Constitution, but he is not very commonly used, but this time they do call it he. So they imply that the president's going to be male. I'm sorry, just 1 second here. I seem to have lost my screen. Okay, sorry, I'm back. Okay. Okay. What does that mean? The president shall take care that the laws be faithfully executed. Well, that's up to the president to interpret to a great extent. That is, presidents are supposed to enact a law, but what if they don't like the law? What if it's passed over their veto? Or what if they don't agree with Congress on a law that Congress has passed? Now, then the president has some leeway in terms of how they can interpret it. Presidents have taken to doing what's called executive orders. And this goes back all the way to George Washington. But executive order originated when Washington started giving orders to his own branch of the government, the bureaucracy, on how they should operate. So executive orders can be things like they give out an executive order that everybody shall be at work at 8:30 in the morning, or everybody will work 35 hours a week, or they'll lower the flag to half staff in honor of some person who's passed away. Those can be executive orders, but executive orders can also extend to basically being almost forms of legislative action. That is, an executive order that restricts the entrance of people from certain countries because they're Muslim majority countries is a way of restricting immigration into the country, which isn't really part of a president's job according to the Constitution, but could be interpreted as the president faithfully executing the laws. Okay, so I mentioned before, presidents are indirectly elected. There were three real options here that the framers of the Constitution considered. Who should choose the president? So one was the possibility that the House of Representatives are directly elected by the people. And so in a sense, the people have spoken when they vote for their representatives. And so it would make sense that the House of Representatives would be the body that would actually appoint then a president. And they could appoint a president even from their own people, their own representatives, or they could appoint somebody that they thought was a worthy person to be leading the country, somebody like George Washington. Second option was the people would directly elect the president. The problem the framers had with the people voting for them was that they thought that the people wouldn't know anything about the candidates. Talking about a time when most people couldn't read or write in the United States, and most people had no form of communication with anything outside their own very narrow little place, their own little village or their farm or whatever. And so how would people know if a person would be a good president or not? And so the framers were worried that the people would basically vote for famous people, somebody they'd heard of, and not necessarily well qualified people. And so they decided that wasn't going to work. They decided instead on a third option, which was that the states would do this, that the states would appoint electors. Now, these electors would be appointed by the state legislature. And what this meant then is that those electors were probably going to be people who were prominent in state politics. They could be elected officials in the state. They could be people who are associated with parties. They could be donors to campaigns. They could be prominent people, business people, newspaper people, famous people, landowners, whatever kind of things. Well, these would be the electors. This would give all the states a say, and the Electoral College votes were going to be distributed among the states according to their size, so that it would be dependent upon their size, the size of the congressional delegate. How many members of the House and Senate do they have? That's how many electoral votes they have. So the minimum number of electoral votes a state can have is 3 electoral votes. A place like Wyoming has 2 senators because it's a state, but it only has 1 representative because its population is small. Well, that means 3 people, so they get 3 electoral votes. So in the Electoral College, the biggest delegates are California, Florida, and New York in that order. I'm sorry, California, Texas, Florida, and New York in that order, the big 4 ones, which account for more than 1/4 of the total electoral votes. Well, the idea was then that the people would be tempered. The people could go and they could vote for candidates, but if they made bad choices, their state legislatures could then basically change that vote by choosing electors who would vote according to what the legislature wanted rather than according to the people's will. So there is a possibility that the presidential election could be decided regardless of the popular vote. And this has happened a number of times in American history. I think it's 4 times altogether when a president has lost the popular vote and still become the president. 2016 was the last time this happened, when Hillary Rodham Clinton won the popular vote across the country. But because the distribution of that vote, the Electoral College gave more electoral votes to Donald Trump. Because California, Texas, New York, Florida, a candidate who carries 50% plus 1 vote of the majority in that state gets 100% of the electoral votes. And so it's possible that say Hillary Rodham Clinton got, say, 67% of the vote in California. She got 100% of the electoral votes. Donald Trump got something like 51% of the vote in Florida, but he got 100% of the electoral votes. The framers of the Constitution thought that what was likely to happen was that most elections would actually go back to the House, that there would be inconclusive results that would come from the popular vote, and therefore inconclusive results in the Electoral College. And what you would end up with a lot of times was a hung deal where you'd get multiple candidates dividing up the electoral votes, so none of them got a majority. And if nobody gets a majority of the electoral votes, 270, then the House of Representatives decides on who's the president. This is what was behind Donald Trump's attempts to overturn the election of 2020, leading up to the certification of the election on January 6th of 2021. Okay. But take a look at the maps of the presidential elections. What you'll see is the US is pretty divided. There are blue states and there are red states across the region. The blue states being democratically minded states, particularly located on the East Coast and the West Coast, particularly in the Northeast, places like New York, most of the New England states, New Jersey, tend to vote Democratic. And then you've got places like Washington, Oregon, California, which tend to be Democratic. And then you've got places like in the South and the Midwest that are reliably Republican, places like Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana, Arkansas, except for Bill Clinton's period, Missouri, Kansas, Nebraska, South Dakota, North Dakota, Wyoming, Montana, Idaho, those places tend to be Republican. But what you can look at, if you look at the map of the 2020 election, what you see is that what's happening is that there's a split between urban and suburban versus rural and small town America. And that's what the real division is. If you look at how the votes were distributed in 2020 election, it's between the cities and the countryside, basically. Joe Biden won 50.9% of the popular vote. He got 306 electoral votes, or 57% of the electoral votes. He won 25 states and the District of Columbia, which represent a total population of 179.3 million Americans. So the majority of the population, a bare majority of the popular vote, a larger majority of the electoral votes, and a huge majority of the population. Donald Trump got 47.3%, that should be a percent sign there, sorry, 47.3% of the popular vote. They got 232 electoral votes, which is 43% of the electoral votes. So he actually got fewer electoral votes, a lower percentage of electoral votes than he got of the popular election. He did win 25 of the states. And so they're almost evenly matched there. He got 25 states, Biden got 25 states, but Biden got 25 heavily populated states. Donald Trump got 25 less populated states. So his 25 states represent about 130.5 million of the population. Break this down further, what they've found is that in rural areas, small town areas that have less than 2,000 people per square mile, to be a place like Delhi, New York, about 70% of the votes in those areas went to Donald Trump. In urban and suburban areas that have more than 2,000 square people per square mile, so you're talking about urban areas like New York City, but you're also talking about suburban areas like the suburbs of Atlanta or suburbs of Kansas City, about 60% of that vote went to Joe Biden. So you got more people in the cities and suburbs. 60% of those people voting for Biden means a way more votes. Now, keep in mind that way the electoral college works is that for all but 2 states, the winner of the state, however slim their majority is, they get 100% of the electoral votes. They get the entire state. There's been calls in the last few election cycles to change that, to make it so that the electoral votes are distributed proportionate to the popular vote. Now, this is a proposal put forth mostly by Republicans so far, who are hoping to get some of those votes from places like New York and California, because they know there are large swaths of conservative voters in these 2 states that would vote for Republicans, but those states consistently go to the Democrats because they get a simple, bare majority. They get all 100% of the electoral votes. Okay, so now the president's elected. What can the president do exactly? Okay, so I mentioned before that there are limitations on the power of the executive. That is, he has to get the advice and consent of the Senate for treaties and appointments. The budgetary process begins in the House, comes to the Senate, so the president can't spend money of his own accord. He has ways to distribute money once it's been allocated, but he can't actually take tax money and spend it on his own. He has war powers to a certain extent. That is, he's the commander in chief, but he can't actually declare war. And if he does send troops into war, which they do more recently over the last 70 years, the president has to get support from Congress to pay for that action. And so Congress has control of the purse. The customary powers of the president, as the book talks about, a number of things there. Teddy Roosevelt talked about the president's bully pulpit, which meant basically that it's a platform for the president to speak. The president is the most prominent person probably in the United States, one of the most powerful people in the United States and in the world. When the president speaks, it's on the news. And the presidents used to have much more than they do these days, but they used to have regular conferences or news things and speeches they do from the White House that were on national TV in the evenings. I haven't been doing that much in the last few presidents, but I remember when I was a kid seeing the president on TV a lot. And they'd come on, they'd talk about various kinds of things they wanted, and it was a way for them to put pressure on Congress or the Supreme Court to do things they wanted by reaching out directly to the American people, who would then write to their Congress people and say, yes, do what the president wants. Over the last 100 years, there's been the emergence of what they call the imperial president. That is, the president has way more power than presidents used to have. If you think back on history, now look at that thing up on the first page there of the 45 men who've been president. How many of those 45 men can you name, actually? Most of them are likely to be more recent ones. You remember them in part because you may have been alive when they were president, but also because they're much more prominent in terms of American politics. They have a lot more power. They have a lot more sway over things. And this is for a few reasons. One is because of the Great Depression and in World War II. During the Great Depression, the New Deal, which was a response, led to the creation and expansion of the federal bureaucracy, the new kind of areas that hadn't been involved with in terms of the economy and Social Security, various things like that. World War II also led to a massive expansion of the federal bureaucracy that never really went away. The US government expanded tremendously under Roosevelt, and it never shrank again. Even under Ronald Reagan, who thought he was cutting the budget in order to shrink the government, it actually grew. The federal budget grew under Reagan, didn't shrink. So you get a much more powerful president, much more influential in a lot of ways. Presidents also set agendas. Think about Joe Biden with his infrastructure and his spending packages he wants done. Presidents shape things by appointing judges and directors of programs and things like that. In particular, appointment of federal judges, because all federal judges, district judges, appeals judges, and the Supreme Court are appointed by the president. Donald Trump, in his 4 years as president, appointed more judges than any other president in American history, more than 50 judges. And those judges are appointed for life. So the president can have a profound effect on things like considering whether women have the right to an abortion in the United States. By appointing judges that are hostile to things like that, you can actually change previous Supreme Court decisions and affect the country in the way the president wants to shape it for decades. Presidents also tend to be the leader of their parties. They can give pardons to people convicted of federal crimes, which means that Congress, even if it investigates things like misdoings of the president's administration and people are convicted for crimes, the president can pardon them. They do so at some risk because pardons may or may not be politically popular, and a president in their first term may be loath to give pardons because they may think that's going to cost them the election next time. Executive orders are another sign of increasing presidential power. Washington gave out 8 executive orders, most of them dealing with basically the functioning of the bureaucracy. FDR was the one who gave the most. He was also the longest serving president. He gave out 3,500 of these things. Again, most of those are geared towards the workings of the federal bureaucracy, that they should be doing this that way, not this way, kind of a thing. Obama, Trump did 150 or so of them. They must have done this before while he was still president. Sorry. Consider also the role of the president in influencing public opinion. The president has, according to the book, 4 audiences, basically. The Beltway audience, that is the Beltway, the highway that runs around Washington, D.C. That was known as the Beltway. The president influences what goes on within that territory, which is D.C. and its close environment where the government is located. He has the audience of the Congress, which is listening for guidance from him. Maybe sometimes they want him to crack some heads and push some things harder than he is. You've got then the party faithful, that is the political party that he's a member of, Democratic or Republican Party. They listen to the president because he's the leader, particularly in his first term. They listen because they're thinking he'll run for re-election. Second term, the president's influence in the party can diminish. Donald Trump's influence in the Republican Party is still very strong a year after he's been out of the presidency. And so he may continue to affect the party for some years going into the future. The third audience for presidents is the public. That is through the television, through social media these days, by giving speeches, by going around the country, meeting with people, campaigning, various kinds of things like that. He meets with the American people. Americans tend to look to the president for guidance on things. They tend to blame the president when things don't go so well. They may give the president credit when things go well, though it's more likely to be blame than credit that he gets. And the world is the other audience the president has. The world listens to what the leader of the United States has to say, and they want to know what he's thinking about the economy. They want to know what he's thinking about various conflicts. They want to know what he's thinking about global warming. They want to know that the president is saying the things they want to hear. And if the president's not, then they need to figure out what to do about that. State of the Union addresses the way the president, one way the president can address things. The president is also the U.S.'s chief diplomat. He is the guy who meets with other leaders. He's the one who meets with ambassadors, people like that. The president has increasingly taken the role of mourner in chief. That is, after mass shootings, the president generally is on the news talking about the horrible tragedy, and we feel for the people who have lost family members and people like that. You may remember, you wouldn't remember, I suppose, but your parents would remember George W. Bush after 9/11 being the mourner in chief, basically. Presidents also give out something called the Medal of Freedom. Now, this is something the president has the power to give out. Congress has its own medals that it can give out to people. The president can give out medals of freedom to basically anybody. And lots of people, prominent Americans have gotten these medals. Now, oftentimes they're people in the arts. They're usually, sometimes they're controversial. Sometimes they're not so controversial. Oftentimes they're people who are popular. Norman Rockwell, the painter, Steven Spielberg, the movie director, Ralph Ellison, Maya Angelou, authors. Elvis Presley has gotten a Medal of Freedom. Mother Teresa has gotten a Medal of Freedom. And so these are kind of ways in which the president can sort of set a tone by giving awards out or by not giving out awards to certain kinds of people. And so it shows something about their own politics as well. And finally, presidents also do these White House ceremonies, musical events, concerts, things like that, where artists are invited to come to the White House and perform. They do the Easter egg hunt each year, various kinds of things like that. Now, these are things that presidents do, right? So the president has this very serious job of being the head politician, and being the leader of a party, and being the person, the head of a government. But they also have got these ceremonial kinds of things that are incidental to being a president. Some of them are better at it than others. Some of them like doing these things more than others. Some of them just hate doing these kind of things and just refuse to do them sometimes. All right, move on to the executive branch. The president is first and foremost, according to the Constitution, the head of this bureaucracy. He's the head of an executive branch, which is the third branch, one of the three branches of the government. His executive branch is located in this building called the Executive Building, which is this gray French-style architecture building, which is a gigantic thing that sits just west of the White House. West of the White House? I think it's west of the White House. The president has a number of people he relies upon. He's first of all got his inner circle of people. These are people who basically are his creation. It doesn't require the Senate to approve their appointments. He gets to choose these people, and he can make these appointments regardless of what anybody thinks. He doesn't have to appoint people to these positions. We can change them. They can eliminate positions. He can create positions. And so he's got people who basically are his closest advisors. And these are oftentimes people that he's worked with before, that he knows from previous jobs. In the case of Joe Biden, he was the vice president for 8 years, so he knows a lot of people in Washington. He knows a lot of people from the Obama administration. He's worked with a lot of them. And so he chooses these people, the chief of staff being the sort of the top person here, because the chief of staff is the person who controls access to the president, who actually gets into the Oval Office to see the president. That depends on the chief of staff. The president wants to see somebody, he'll tell the chief of staff, make the arrangements. But if you just call up the White House and say you'd like to meet with Joe Biden, chances are the chief of staff is going to say no to your request. There's a White House counsel, which is a person who gives them legal advice. The national security advisor is a person who has its connections to the Department of Defense, the CIA, the various intelligence agencies, things like that. But the national security advisor isn't generally connected to either of those, any of those branches or any of those agencies. They're independent. And so the idea is they give independent advice to the president. In the case of Joe Biden, he has a COVID-19 response team. There's also a domestic policy council led by an advisor, Susan Rice, who's been around in Washington for a long time. Oftentimes they have an economic advisor. They have a director of communications and a press secretary. The press secretary is Jen Psaki, who is a person you're likely to see on TV. Jen Psaki is a redheaded woman who is very erudite and very, very well informed on things. She's the person who gives the various press releases, and she meets with the press generally every day. Different presidents like the press or don't like the press. Some of them avoid the press. Some of them like the press and they meet with them constantly. Sometimes they'll show up at White House briefings with the press. Sometimes they won't. Sometimes they'll depend upon their press advisor. The cabinet is a formal organization because the US government has cabinet agencies, which are created not by the Constitution, they're created by the president, and then they're funded by Congress. So they have to get Senate approval and they have to get congressional approval to be funded. And they change from time to time. The cabinet are people who are heads of agencies themselves. And so they are the little mini president, in a sense, in their own agency. They sit at a table, with the president in the cabinet room, and they sit in proximity to the president in accordance with the age of their agency. So when the president sits at the cabinet table, the president sits in the middle, not at an end, sits in the middle. The Secretary of State, being the oldest agency, sits to the president's right. The Secretary of the Treasury, being the second oldest agency, sits to the president's left, et cetera. And so got a list of them here. You can see the various cabinet secretaries. Oftentimes, these are, again, people who the president knows. Their relationship with the president may be close or distant because these are official types. And so oftentimes they're political appointments. The president thinks we need this type of person, a Latino, an African-American, a woman, somebody like that. We need somebody who's to the left, or we need somebody who's to the right. We need somebody who's got the respect of the military, various kinds of things like that. And so it's a highly politicized appointment. And because of that, the cabinet secretaries may be somebody the president knows and likes, but they may not necessarily be. They're not like the inner circle, which are definitely people the president is comfortable with. There are also a number of cabinet level positions. These are people who are heads of agencies, not they're cabinet agencies, but are still important. Things like the CIA, the ambassador to the UN, the Council of Economic Advisors, which is a group of independent economists who advise the president and Congress, trade representatives, administrator of the Environmental Protection Agency, various kinds of things like that. So these agencies aren't to the level of being cabinet ones. They are part of another agency that is a cabinet level thing, like the CIA is part of the Department of Justice, I want to say. And then there's the bureaucracy. The other thing the president oversees is the bureaucracy. Now, when you think about the government, in a lot of sense, what you're really thinking about is the bureaucracy, the bureaucrats, because those are the ones that we as citizens have the most dealing with. We don't see Congress people on a regular basis, but when you go to the Department of Motor Vehicles, you're dealing with the bureaucracy. That's a state bureaucracy. If you go to the Social Security Administration, you're dealing with the federal bureaucracy. You're dealing with bureaucrats. There are a couple of views about the bureaucracy, and a lot of our views come from the work of a guy named Max Weber, a German social thinker who was around the late 19th, early 20th century. Max Weber argues that bureaucracy runs on what's called rational authority. He talked about authority, about why do we follow leaders. He said that there are three types here: traditional, rational, charismatic. Rational authority is what we have in modern industrial societies. There are rules, there are laws, it's all written out, there are courts, there are people who enforce them, and they're enforced universally. They are open, we know what they are, we know they're predictable, and so they're rational authority. George Orwell in 1984 writes a story about bureaucracy run amok. Right? He's talking about this guy named Winston Smith, who works in the Ministry of Truth, which is a government agency, a bureaucracy, gigantic bureaucracy that's entire responsibility is telling lies to the citizens of the state that Winston Smith lives in. And outside the Ministry of Truth are carved into its building the slogan, "War is peace, freedom is slavery, ignorance is strength." And Orwell's notion is that that was what the modern world was becoming, a gigantic bureaucracy that controls all information, controls our lives for no interest other than its own interests. Well, the federal bureaucracy has a number of distinct features in the US. that make it somewhat different than a lot of other countries. First of all, the bureaucracy is run not only by the president. All authority does not come from the president, is also shared with Congress, because Congress has financial oversight. And so bureaucrats have to go to Congress from time to time and have to talk about what their agencies are doing. They have to justify their spending, and they have to do things that Congress wants them. So it's not just up to the president, even though he is the head of the bureaucracy. His authority over them is shared, again, this division of powers in the United States Constitution. In the US, because of the federalist system that distributes authority between national level, state, and local, that means that federal bureaucrats share their functions and their powers with state and local agencies as well. So think about the FBI. The law enforcement agency at the federal level works with the state police, works with local police departments in doing things like solving crimes. Federal bureaucracies in the US also operate under pretty close public scrutiny. That is, their operations are public. They publish what their decisions are. A lot of their meetings are open. They have open meetings a lot of times to ask public opinions on these kind of things. And in the United States, federal bureaucracy can be sued by interest. That is, if let's say the Department of Interior makes decisions about issuing leases for oil drilling on federal land, people can sue. People who want to stop those leases from being used can sue, or people who want those leases to be given out can sue the federal government to force the federal government to do things because they're what they want them to. Federal agencies also in the US tend to contract out services. That is, much of what you get done by federal bureaucracy is not done actually by people who work for the federal government, but by proxies, that is, contractors who do the job for the federal government. So if you go down to the Social Security Administration and meet with somebody there, you may be talking to somebody who works for the federal government. You may be talking to somebody who works for a company that's paid by the federal government to staff the office. Lots of things in the United States are done by proxy. For instance, Food and Drug Administration is supposed to be inspecting drugs for quality and safety and purity. They don't do that stuff. They hire companies to do that. They hire people sometimes who work for the companies that make the drugs to do the inspections, or sometimes they'll have independent contractors who will do these production of things. If you think about the COVID vaccine, for instance, these were produced by companies, Pfizer, Moderna, et cetera, paid by the US government to do this under the supervision of the Food and Drug Administration and the Centers for Disease Control, which are both federal agencies, but it was a private company working all in collaboration with each other to produce the vaccines. So how big is the US bureaucracy? There are about 2.7 million people who work for the federal government. It is the largest single employer in the United States. More people work for the federal government than work for any company in the US. Most of those 2.7, well, a lot of those people work for the Postal Service, which makes them kind of federal employees and not kind of federal employees, because the Postal Service is partly privatized federal agencies, created originally as a federal agency. So originally all postal workers were federal employees, but over the years, particularly the last few decades, a lot of the Postal Service has been privatized. So those people now are oftentimes contractors. California has the largest, you can see these various things here. The Department of Defense employs about 700,000 people. That is the largest cabinet department in the United States. So 700,000 of those people work for the Department of Defense, another 380,000 work for Veterans Affairs, another 200,000 work in Homeland Security. So defense-related things employ about 1.2, 1.3 million people out of those 2.7. So almost half of the bureaucracy works in security and defense. Take a look down at the bottom of the list here. The Environmental Protection Agency employs about 16,000 people. The Department of Education employs about 4,000 people. 4,000 people out of that 2.7 million work for the Department of Education. Okay. The book talks about bureaucrats as well. You go into an office to meet with somebody to have something done for you, you're going to be confronting a bureaucrat, whether they work for the government or whether they're a contractor. They are people who work in the bureaucracy. That makes them what we call bureaucrats. The book points out there are 4 things that explain their behavior. Right? Why do they act the way they do? Are they nice to you? Are they helpful? Are they mean to you? Do they require you to do kind of lots and lots of paperwork? Do you have to keep going back again, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? Are they helpful? Are they, do they just make it worse? Well, there are a number of things that affect their behavior and why they operate the way they do. One is the recruitment and reward system. That is, some people who work for the federal government have to get their jobs through a competitive process. That is, they have to take an exam, civil service exam. They have to pass the exam before they can be considered to be hired for a position. They have to prove their qualification, which means they need to have a certain level of education, a certain level of knowledge, perhaps a certain level of experience. And then there's the accepted part of the bureaucracy. These are people who are hired because of their expertise. Generally, they don't do an exam. So people who are hired to high-level positions, say at the FBI or the CIA or something like that, they're not hired through an exam process. Accepted people include people who work in the cabinet. The people who are appointed by the president generally are accepted. It's a presidential appointment, not a civil service exam kind of a thing. Second thing, personal attributes. That is, everybody's got a background. Everybody's got certain kinds of politics. They view the federal government in certain ways. They view the people they serve certain kinds of ways. And so they may be friendly people. They may not be friendly people. That's all part of their background. So those personal attributes play a role. Second thing is the nature. The third thing is the nature of their job here. That is, a lot of bureaucrats are in temporary positions. That is, hired for specific kinds of things. For instance, the U.S. survey, the census survey, which is done every 10 years. U.S. Census is taken, which requires the federal government to hire hundreds of thousands of people to go around trying to find out information about people, to get them to fill out their census forms so that we can collect an accurate count of all the people in the country. Those are temporary jobs. They last a few months. Those are jobs for people like college students to do. Permanent jobs are ones in which you're appointed for a position because of your qualifications, and it's independent of the president's term. So it's a permanent position. So a lot of people, say, working for something like the Library of Congress, the Postal Service, they can work in that position for decades. Other people are appointed by the president for their term, basically. And so they are there as long as the president's in power. When the president leaves, they offer their resignation to the incoming president. The incoming president replaces a lot of those people. And these are a lot of people higher level in the various bureaucratic agencies. Fourth thing is constraints on bureaucrats. That is, there are lots of outside things that interfere with the work of bureaucrats and their agencies. Congress wanting oversight, Congress wanting to know about money, Congress wanting certain agencies to do certain kinds of things, certain kinds of ways. You've got interest groups, people watching what's going on. Those people watching the oil drilling or the pipeline construction, or people watching the border patrol at the Mexican border. You've also got journalists who are paying attention to this and sometimes publishing non-flattering stories about things that are happening in the bureaucracy. You may remember a few months ago, this thing that came out in the national media about these border patrol agencies in Texas riding around on horses with whips, attacking people who are trying to cross the Rio Grande River. Bad optics, but we wouldn't have known about that if it hadn't been published on the media and shown up on television and social media. So journalists can play a role, whether those are citizen journalists or whether those are people who work for the media professionally. All right. Another thing the book talks about, a thing called the iron triangle here, which is a thing that affects the way the bureaucracy and Congress work. That is, the notion here is that you've got these 3 things, these 3 corners of a triangle here. On one hand, you've got down here the members of an interest group, people who are interested in particular issues. They want to shape the way the bureaucracy deals with those issues. Let's take the oil drilling here. People who work for oil companies or have oil investments want the bureaucracy to issue oil drilling licenses. But people in those bureaucratic agencies who issue the licenses report to Congress, and Congress has legislative committees that oversee these bureaucracies. And so Congress, you may have people who are hostile to further drilling for petroleum. They don't want those licenses issued. So there's this three-way kind of relationship. But what's happening is, according to this notion of the iron triangle, is that this is a closed triangle. Where are the people in this? Where are the people who voted for these legislators? They have no control over these bureaucratic people because we don't appoint those. We don't elect people to the bureaucracy. They're appointed because they know people who are in the legislature, or they know people who are in interest groups, or they're from an interest group. And so what happens oftentimes is that the federal bureaucracy, when it needs to appoint somebody, it will appoint somebody from an industry that it's actually supposed to be overseeing. Something like the Food and Drug Administration will hire scientists who work for drug companies because they know their business, they know the drugs, those kind of things. But then those scientists who work for, say, Pfizer, now all of a sudden they're part of an agency that's supposed to be overseeing Pfizer. Is that going to compromise that oversight? Is that going to improve the relationship? Is it going to mean that basically Pfizer gets a pass because the agency is no longer overseeing Pfizer because this person who was a vice president at Pfizer runs the agency now? And then what you've got is people in Congress, when they leave Congress, what happens a lot of times is Congress people will leave Congress and they'll become lobbyists for an interest group because they know people in Congress, they have connections. And so these interest groups will hire them, sometimes with gigantic wages, and put them to work, basically try to influence Congress to do things that it wants, that the interest group wants, and also to lobby the agencies to get them to enforce things in such a way as the interest group wants as well. So there's this idea that there's an iron triangle here. And one of the things it's doing is basically diminishing the role of the voter and our ability to oversee the operation of the government by excluding us from this cozy three-way relationship that has developed here in Washington and around the country. All right, I'm going to stop there. Thank you for coming today. Let me know if you have any questions. I'm available. You can see me in my office hours on Tuesday, or let me know if there's another time you'd like to meet. We can set up something. All right, otherwise, happy reading. Good luck with everything, and I will see you next time.